kurinuki, which I can show you some examples. I unfortunately took them all home the other day so I can photograph them, but I've got photographs of what these pieces come out like. Again, it's kind of the concept of like dry throwing, right? We don't want to use a bunch of water if we can avoid it, right? So I'm going to start out with a pretty big chunk of clay. If I want to make something relatively tall or even relatively wide, this is all reductive process. It's not necessarily you taking a piece of clay and making it bigger. You kind of start with your shape as big as you want it to be, and then we'll take material away, right? So we want this to be nice and stuck on there. We also want it to be pretty centered. So a lot of times I just play the like double smack game to get this on like there.
Normal?
What's that?
Do you wet the bat like normal?
This one's plastic, so plastic bats you don't necessarily wet, but on a traditional bat I probably would, right? So you want this to be as close to perfectly centered as you can. Traditionally what I'll do is I'll just center this whole thing and then scrape all the goop off. What you can also do though, is while it's spinning, almost like we do, try not to do that, almost like we do when we're cutting off the skirt, right? We can work our way down and kind of cut it more centered than it was. That didn't work out super well. I usually don't do this. Theoretically, you could, right? And if I have like a wooden rib, I can then sort of scrape all that gunk off. And like this outside surface is pretty close to the middle now, right? Traditionally, though, what I do is I just center the piece because it's easier for me than doing that whole deal. That's really useful if you're doing like wide things. Like if I wanted to just like smash this down and have like a round plate, I could cut off the edge. When you're trying to cut off a ton of clay, it becomes a little bit trickier. So I'm just going to spend a second squishing this up and down, right? Doing the coning thing where I squeeze with two hands, rise up with it, and then I smash those back down. Like so. And this doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be doing so much like weird random stuff to the outside that it doesn't really matter. I do want to make this kind of tall, so I'm going to center it a little bit higher than I usually would, right? And then I don't need any of this goopy stuff on the outside. Again, this is a dry throwing technique, so I'm just going to spend a second scraping off all that goop so that it's not messing me up later. And in doing that, I'll kind of give the top a little bit of a flat there, right? I'm gonna go into there. Can you grab me a sponge? I don't know where my sponge is. Right behind the bucket. Aha! So once we've got it to this stage, basically we're gonna be trimming it while it's on the wheel, right? We're gonna be trimming it really wet. You can use almost any sort of trimming tool for this. There's a couple that I've found to be a little more useful than others. And these Japanese or Korean style trimming tools that are basically just like pieces of metal that are bent into a sort of like half windmill shape, work really well for this, right? We have a couple of them in here. You can also buy them at like High Water. You could probably get away with just like your standard sort of loop tool. You know what I mean?
The trimming tool?
One of these, you know what I mean? If you really wanted to, or especially something like this. And we've got some of these, so if you need to borrow them for the time being, right? But all I'm gonna do now is I start by trying to carve out the middle, right? So I'm gonna come in here while this is spinning, and I'm just going to little bit by little bit do some reductive processing to try to make us have, I'm going to try to make like a cylinder that I'm then going to shape out later, right? But I'm trying to just get rid of a lot of that clay from the inside. So I take some out, I let it kind of spin and pool on the actual tool, pull that out, and then I make more.
They make those tools different lengths?
Yeah, they have a bunch of them. Like even the ones we have here, there's a few, right? Like this red one here that's got like kind of the hooked end works really well for that. There's kind of big ones with big gouges. This one I found to be pretty useful.
Mud Tools has a really good one of those, and you can get it on Amazon for like $8.
Oh, cool.
So try not to get greedy. Sometimes if you try to take too much clay at a time, it'll just like re-press itself against the walls of the piece, right? Which we're trying to avoid. I'm just going to keep doing this until I get it down to be a decent bottom diameter, right? Or bottom thickness, rather. And you want to try to keep this semi-centered. If your tool moves around a little bit on the inside, it's not the end of the world. Usually I use this process to make pieces that are not, like this isn't how you would make like a perfect piece, right? Sort of the intent of it is that it's got a lot of like room for human error. And we're going to sort of embrace that and sort of run with it, right?
Would you estimate how thick the base?
Half an inch, 3/4.
Not that thick usually. I'm going to try to get it as close to as if I was like throwing it, right?
Okay.
So maybe 1/4 of an inch is what I'm shooting for the base. And that seems pretty close there. But my walls now are like on the bottom maybe like a full inch thick, and then on the top maybe like a 1/2 inch thick, right? So I'm going to compress this. And the next step we do, and this is really like a do whatever you want to do sort of thing, right? I'm going to be taking away material from the outside by hand, and I'm going to do that in like a way that yields me kind of a not necessarily geometric, almost like geological, like rock-like formation, right? And I'm going to do that by using a bunch of different tools. Anything sharp will work. This is a wiggle wire, so it's also just like a spring that's stretched out. And with that, you can do really interesting stuff like this, right? Yeah. So you can do a bunch of different facets. I do some of them up and down like that. I do some of them where I just take like random chunks out, pull those guys out, and then I'll switch over to just using like whatever random tools I have. So I have like just random things here. I'm going to take a big chunk out of the bottom. All right, let me spin this so you guys can see. I'm going to do that, and then like rip and pull, because I want it to have sort of like a rock face texture, right? There's also tools like this that kind of the same thing as a wiggle wire, but it's just a straight wire. You can get like interesting step things going on there. I'm not super worried about the design on the bottom because I am going to carve away a bunch of that bottom because that's where it's the heaviest. One thing you want to be mindful of is you don't want to get it super, super thin at this stage because I am going to stretch it a little bit. If it's already really thin, where it stretches, it's going to have a hole there, right? And so I really do like to, like you can see the difference between like doing a full stroke and then going down and then pulling out. You get kind of a step, and I like that step action that goes on there. So I'm just going to spend a second kind of doing that whole thing. Sometimes I really like to hit this tool from the side so that I can get a step that goes vertical too. And all these are just going to yield you like a really ergonomic, like fun to hold piece. Do that there. I'm trying to be careful not to take a lot of material away from the very tip top, right? Because that's where it's the thinnest. It's real thick on the bottom. So I'm just going to look around for places that need a little bit of love. Hit those real quick. And I also don't like too many of the same tool marks right next to each other. So I try to be mindful of that as I work around. So I end up with some a little bit of like natural randomness because I'm trying to mimic nature. You know what I mean? Pull this around. This all looks good. This looks good. Maybe do some sideways ones here. You could even do like this like little carving away like that. Like you don't have to be taking away a ton of material. This is going to yield you like a relatively heavy piece most of the time. Depends on how much time you want to spend trimming it up and stuff. But I think I might end there, and then I'm going to switch over to stretching, right? So if I try to stretch this out with my hand covered in water like this, it's going to just stretch out kind of evenly. But if I have a dry hand or a dry tool, what that has a tendency to make happen is the piece will torque around. So all these designs will be like expanded, but also expanded and twisted because it'll like there'll be a lot of friction on my hand, right? So I usually start out with a little bit of moisture just so I can kind of get the process started, right? And all I'm doing on the inside is just kind of making a claw and pulling it out slightly. And it'll get a little off center when you do this. That's fine because you're not going to be able to tell where the center is based on what the piece looks like, right? Get it to maybe there. Check out what we've done, see if we like it, see if we don't like it. Again, everything's going to be sort of exaggerated once we stretch it a little bit. I'm trying to mop some of that water out. Now I'm going to use a dry hand, try to do some stretching and maybe get like a little bit of torque going on. And that will cause the piece to twist a little bit as I go up. I'm trying not to stretch a ton at one time because I do have spots that are thinner than others and I don't want to break the piece, right?
And your hand's completely dry?
Yeah. And so if your hand is dry, as you're in there, you can kind of just use like a smaller fingertip to do stretching as opposed to your whole pad here, and that'll stop it from sort of wiggling around as much. But I might actually stop there because as I'm looking at it from the top down, my lip up here is starting to get a little thin, and I don't want that to be thin. So I might spend a second sort of compressing that. And then get down here and sort of take a look at it. Like, I think that's a cool, interesting shape for a cup, you know what I mean? Or like theoretically this could be a mug or whatever, right? Now I know I have a ton of weight on the very bottom, right? So I'm gonna do the same thing we do when we're sort of trimming away the skirt on a throne piece, right? I'm gonna come in here, starting pretty high. And you gotta have really firm hands for this part. And I'm gonna carve away as much of that clay as I can muster until I hit that bottom edge.
Oh, that looks great.
And we can do the same thing we do usually, right? Where we fill that moat we've just made with water. Sort of carve down like that. Pull all of that away. And like even that has like a pretty kind of rough vibe to it that kind of matches with everything else. Theoretically, you could leave it like that. If you wanted it to be cleaned up, you could spend a little bit more time here, sort of refining what that looks like. Because it's kind of interesting to have like a really smooth bottom and then like a really rough upper form, right? Is that our timer?
Yeah, do you want me to go check on it?
Yeah, go for it. So maybe get it to there, and I think I might call that there. I think the last thing I would do is maybe give it a little bit of a drinking edge, right? Which we'll do again by coming in up top here. It's a little off center, so I'm not being super firm with my pressure. But I just want it to be a smidge sharper up there. That way it fits into the corner of your mouth. And then I think from there we might call it. So the last thing I usually do on a piece like this, theoretically you could let this dry, turn it upside down, trim it to get all the weight out of the bottom, right? A lot of times what I'll do is I'll take this same wiggle wire, which yielded us this really cool kind of zigzaggy design like that, and I'll just mimic that, but on the bottom. And that'll yield us, let's see if I can pick this up without messing it up, really interesting foot design too. Like this is a really kind of fun way to make something that looks like it took you a long time or that you're like really skilled, and I did that in like 10 minutes, you know what I mean? Thank you, appreciate it. You can sit down some more. And that piece is done. That's how you do kurinuki.